let me go through a couple of slides and I have about 10 slides in total to give some examples. Okay, so first off, here are the 4 stakeholders that I mentioned before that I'll be focusing on. And these are, again, managers, the public, policymakers, and students. And here are some channels that I've used in that dissemination. So I've used, for managers, and I'll talk mostly about managers, the idea here is what I call crossover journals. Those are Harvard Business Review and Sloan Management Review and California Management Review that are kind of quasi-academic, but also really oriented toward managers. They all have their different editorial processes, and we can get into that if you like in terms of peer review and editorial engagement. The business press, by business press, I mean things like Business Week or Forbes or Inc. Trade journals, by that I mean specialist journals that are functional in orientation. So there's like a CIO magazine or a CEO Insights or journals for safety practitioners or for environmental managers. So that's what I mean by trade journals. Op-eds would be pieces that you place where you hope to influence managers in mass media outlets. Webinars, this can be, for example, an HBR webinar or a webinar organized by a practitioner, by a company. And then some of the other thoughts here, practitioner conferences. I've had great success in going to practitioner conferences, sometimes just to listen. And that's actually inspired some of my work. When they say, here's a puzzle, I'm like, I wonder if anyone's investigating that puzzle in a systematic way. Often at practitioner conferences, I am the only academic there, which gives you a sense of where we are in terms of connecting with practice. And also, though, it's kind of like you don't have much competition for any of the ideas that are out there. It can be quite synergistic. And then business podcasts, this would be like the HBR IdeaCast, or there's now your favorite business podcast. They're often looking for content and for guests. And then books, which I don't write, but a lot of my colleagues do, and maybe some of you have done as well. So that's my managerial slice. And then I'm just going to go through these and I'm going to give you some examples. So for the public, you can it's hard, write op-eds for the general public. That's like Wall Street Journal op-eds or New York Times op-eds or The Guardian, mass media outlets, Boston Globe in my town. Generalist podcasts, these are, podcasts with broader audiences than just managers. TED Talks, and again, books, neither of those have I engaged in, but I just put them down because other academics have been quite successful in getting their ideas out to the public through those channels as well. And then another stakeholder that my work sometimes speaks to, and maybe some of you as well, are policymakers. Like that's the practitioner who are the whose decisions we might try and be swaying with some of our research. There you have particular policymaker outlets. It's useful to try and figure out who your target audience, like what do they read? And so I've done a little bit of that. There can be op-eds targeted at them. So for example, if you're trying to influence US policy, trying to place something in the Washington Post is more valuable, or Politico is more valuable than even another outlet that might have a broader distribution, but is less likely to get read by the policymakers you're trying to target. You can give presentations or webinars at think tanks who, it's an indirect way to influence policymakers, because a lot of them are actually, their whole setup is their goal is to influence policymakers. And then policymaker conferences as well. Like where do regulators of whatever flavor you're interested in speaking with, or legislators, where do they assemble, and how can you meet them either informally or by getting on the agenda? And I'll speak a little bit about that as an example. I convened 2 of those with I'd say modest success. So I can speak about that a little bit later. And then for students, the outlets that I've been using, you can, if you write a practitioner piece, of course, you can assign that in your syllabus. So there's spillovers from the other channels. But at least at HBS and in many other schools who specialize in the development of cases and background notes, that's another channel that many of us have available to us, but not all, right? And if you're at a school that doesn't publish cases or notes, I'm not sure that's a feasible channel for you. Although I have worked with folks at those schools and co-authored HBS cases with folks from BU, for example, or other schools, Cornell and Duke, with co-authors. So that's another channel. So let me take you through some examples now that you have sort of an overview, and I'm happy to share these slides afterwards, however we want to disseminate them in case it's helpful. So I'm going to take you through some examples, and I'm going to go from like simpler to more complicated examples just to sort of ease into it. Okay, so one of the topics I've been engaging on for kind of earlier in my career really was this idea of environmental performance disclosure. So how accurate are these disclosures in terms of ratings? For example, we're looking at sustainability ratings, or how do firms respond once they are rated? Or in a regulatory context, if you are required all of a sudden to disclose new environmental indicators, in this case, new toxic pollutants, how do firms respond? So the format of these slides that I'll show you the next few slides, at the top are the research basis of the work that I've done. And then here are some examples of where I disseminated and how I disseminated. So, and one thing I put in the years to just try and give you a sense of like, usually these dissemination vehicles occur after I've written the scholarly paper, but not always. Sometimes working paper is sufficient status. If you feel confident that your analysis is not going to change much through the peer review process, then maybe the working paper stage is the right place. Or I'll show you some examples a little bit later where even prior to having a working paper, if you have like a core of an idea, maybe you can try and engage the public or a particular audience with that idea and get some feedback even before you write the paper. So this one is more simple of all those examples where we tended to write the papers and then write these pieces. So you can see here in the manager category, these are short pieces, so they're pretty easy to write, kind of extended abstracts in a way. The op-ed length of most of these pieces is about 800 words. So that's doesn't take you very long to do, maybe a couple hours. So I wrote a piece in Sloan Management Review and in the Regulatory Review, which is written out of UPenn's law school, and it is specifically geared toward regulators. And then you'll see another one here for HBR Online, which is, again, the HBR Online is a much easier thing to get into than HBR the magazine, and I can talk more about that if you guys want to talk about that. But for two reasons. One is HBR Online, or it's also called HBR Digital. They publish several articles every day, and these are kind of op-ed length articles, and it's pretty quick turnaround, and it's much lighter hand on editing. The pieces for the magazine, they publish many fewer of those. They get many, many proposals, and that takes months of editorial engagement, and then many months once you've locked it in for it actually to get published. So it's kind of a year turnaround time versus what can be a couple of weeks with the HBR Online pieces. And the distribution is actually kind of similar. Like the HBR Online pieces can get 1 million views. I forget what the HBR magazine distribution is, but these omni-channel approaches, they're anyway kind of mixing and matching. So it's an area, I think, of great opportunity for scholars that we're not fully taking advantage of yet. So these last two that I'll just talk over, the last three, and the ones that I'm trying to influence the public, What's the Green is Building. This was in Atlantic, The Guardian, Daily Beast. These were done kind of more at the conceptual stage. So these were not, even though the dates show kind of contemporaneous with some of the other work, these were not disseminations of the research insights per se, which the top ones were. Those were like speaking about like, here's what the paper found. These are more conceptual, saying, here's what these rating systems don't have. For example, Fox News gets credit for the greening of their building, but doesn't get demerits for conveying disinformation about climate change. And we were discovering that when we were digging into the ratings, like what do they include and and with my co-authors, we're discussing like, what do they omit? And so that those became op-ed length pieces that were running kind of in parallel with our thinking of the scholarly work. Okay, so let me pause and read some of the questions in the chat. Okay, the conversation, yes. I've heard a lot of people have success about, with the conversation as an outlet. I haven't explored it myself, but I know it does there's a lot of academics that I know who speak to the benefits of that channel. Can it be based on a conceptual paper? For example, something published in AMR? Yeah, that's a good question, and not one that I actually have much experience with because I'm an empiricist. And so, I think there are lots of new ideas that are out there in HBR and even in op-eds. They're not all, you change X this much and Y changes by that much. So I think you just have to be convincing to the gatekeeper, whoever that is, that the idea is sufficiently novel and robust. So that's kind of a conversation. But, whenever you're doing this dissemination, no one's going to have the same standards like peer review, right? So they were relying on the peer review to assess the rigor of the ideas, or in empirics, the rigor also of the empirics. And that may well be the case as well for folks who are looking through for theory papers. But I wish I could speak more to that, but I just haven't done that kind of work. That's for Etifa. Okay, is there any way of assessing if there is real impact in application in the field? Yeah, this is like the $1 million question that, as you may know, philanthropies are pursuing, business schools are pursuing. This RRBM that Irad and I are associated with is pursuing. There is a really hard one. I mean, that seems like a great topic for another webinar because it's such a bold question. It's such a broad question. People, I think are often looking at hits on, the equivalent of citations in an academic world, which I think is kind of a poor way to measure much, but it is a measure of something. You can also think about the resonance of your ideas in the public sphere by looking at hits, for example, on HBR, or comments, that flow through the conversation, or if you're posting things through LinkedIn in a channel that engages your folks, that would be a place as well for you to get a sense of just the resonance. But whether it's actually being implemented, I mean, that's kind of a one-by-one question, right? Like if you have an idea that if you do X, and I'll give you an example from my own research, which is coming up, which is, if you put a audit teams that have at least one woman, this is audits of working conditions in supply chains, so codes of conduct. If the audit team has at least one woman on it, they tend to find more violations, which means my interpretation of that is they're more rigorous. So I've had that conversation with actual audit companies to share with them that insight. In many cases, it resonated. In many cases, it surprised. Whether they are going to take up that idea and try and engage mixed, try and basically avoid all male audit teams when they can, is something I've heard everything from like, oh, that's really interesting, let me think about that, to I'm not sure by law I can do that. So interesting responses, really hard for me to track whether they've actually done it. I mean, I'd have to have individual conversations with those folks to figure it out. That's an example in my world where it's a really hard question to answer. All right, I'm having trouble giving up here. Let's see. Is it appropriate to write a summary, for example, for HBR from a review paper published in an academic journal? So one of the things, I can talk a little bit about my experience with HBR. One of the things that they're trying to, some of the filters that they use that I've learned sort of the hard way by pitching ideas that never really resonated until more recently. They're looking for ideas that are new. So depending on whether these ideas are new, they're looking for ideas that have practical relevance that CEOs and aspiring CEOs need to know. That's something I didn't realize for a while, because a lot of my work doesn't speak to CEO as an audience. It speaks to more of the sustainability practitioners, which Sloan Management Review actually has a mission among the many functions they're trying to influence, sustainability is one of their core areas. So it depends a little bit on what the topic is that the summary paper is you're referring to. This is Khan. So it depends, right? And the other question is, did you write that paper? Because they're also looking for evidence of expertise, right? So if you wrote that paper and you say, I think there's an interesting insights that managers should know about, and let me change it from a scientific language that might have gone into nature climate change to a managerial orientation, that is something that they might be interested in, especially if you are one of the authors. It's easy enough to pitch. You know, the thing about 800 words is it only takes a couple hours to write. So if you were thinking about it for an online piece, that's a pretty low bar to just try. Okay, conversation comment. Yep, thank you. HBR website, 340,000 paid circulation. Yep, really big numbers. That's something also I didn't understand. HBR, I think, is about 10 times bigger in their reach than Sloan. So while Sloan does have this sustainability track, which for me is useful, you do overall the impact is less. Now, maybe the right people are subscribing to Sloan or checking their websites if they're in the sustainability space. So it's a little hard to know like how you figure out going from the total numbers to the numbers of people who you actually want to reach. That turns out to be really hard. And yes, we'll share these slides. And yes, we'll share the presentation. All right, I'm trying to keep up here. For social media hits of research as a proxy of impact. Oh yeah, altmetric, right? I should have mentioned that. That's an area I was saying when you're trying to figure out impact, altmetric is one of the tools out there that people are exploring. Nicole Taylor, why is there a disconnect between academia and industry? That's a fabulous question. There's actually been some really interesting writing on this question, including by some of my colleagues here at HBS. As I understand it, at least in the business school sphere, the history, you have to sort of understand a little bit about the history of business schools. The history of business schools were really, they began being super practitioner oriented. And teaching things like scheduling, production planning, railroad scheduling, things like that, those very hands-on skills. Then in the 1940s and 50s, this is a US story that I know. I don't know the international flavor of this. In the US, there was a bit of a backlash from the rest of the universities saying like, because business schools there were sometimes standalone, almost like typing schools are standalone. And some were university affiliated. And the fact that they were so pragmatic made some universities uncomfortable because it differed so much from their classic departments of arts and science and other departments. And so that led to academics in business schools saying, okay, we can be more rigorous, we can be more like the rest of universities. And they demonstrated that through more theory building and a separation from practice in most cases. Schools like HBS and a few others have been trying to hold the line of practitioner engagement, but it's interesting, like in some ways that has led to their diminishment of status by other academics. So it's a kind of a complicated story, but that's my understanding of the disconnect. And so now I think schools are starting to realize that they need to be more connected to society and to societal problems because their legitimacy is threatened through the political discourse, at least in the US. So there's, I think, a return to practice. And also the next generation of scholars that are coming in are more suspicious of the ideas that even 20 years ago, people just transitioned. They're like, they came in maybe wanting to study and change how practice occurred. They were trained in doctoral programs that, the way to make impact in A journals is to find gaps in the literature as described by scholars. There was no incentive to actually talk to practitioners. which can slow you down, which can prove you wrong. And that's how it worked for decades. And now I think there's this great movement back toward saying, like, that's kind of silly. Let's actually make sure that we have some grounding on what we're doing, both in the research topics and in the theory building and in communicating insights. And hopefully that's led to many of you being here today. Okay, Ibrat, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I just wanted to ask a question, since we've been touching on the topic of impact. I mean, from your experience, I mean, as you've written different pieces through different channels, what did you find kind of the most, I don't know, maybe not impactful, perhaps that's a big word, but if effective, if you like, in getting your ideas out, kind of communicating to the audience and generating some sort of response or engagement?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really hard question because so let me give more examples and then let's reflect on that, because it really depends on what the insight is, right? And so let me skip this one and let me move through more examples and then we'll reflect on that question, because it depends on what the insight is. So this topic 3, inspections to improve safety. Here I've studied 2 types of inspections: OSHA inspections in the US, that's the labor ministry, and how I've looked at them in DC, like the federal inspectorate, and I've looked at the California version of that. And then I've also looked at restaurant inspections, which are done in the US at the city and county level. So these studies, one is at the city county inspectorate, that's restaurants, one is at the state level, California, and one is at the federal level, which uses about half the states in the US. And from these, some of the insights come with, let me give you some examples of some of the insights that these studies yielded. One is, it turns out that in California and across the US, when a OSHA inspector or a California OSHA inspector randomly selects a factory to go and inspect, the injury rate of that factory declines more rapidly subsequent to that inspection than other factories that were eligible for that randomization, but happen not to be chosen. So this uses the idea that some inspections are actually chosen at random, which is lovely from a research perspective, and it answers a question, which is, do these inspections actually do any good? There's a lot of narrative and debate in the US between whether these inspections do any good and whether they actually lead to factories closing or establishments closing, because they're so harsh that and the regulations are so complicated that if you host an inspection, it dramatically increases the likelihood that the establishment will close down. And this was a real debate over the past 20 years in Washington. And so our research finds, it does by 20% reduces injury rates, and we see no statistically significant difference in the closure rates of establishments who were inspected versus those who weren't. So whose decisions are we trying to influence here? Really, we're trying to provide a little fact basis to this political debate, and we're telling companies that says, if you get an inspection, it's actually not the worst thing in the world, because on average, when the belt tightening that inspection will foster is actually going to lead to a safer workplace. So don't be quite as worried about his inspections as perhaps you would be if you read just people's anecdotal opinions about the consequences of inspection. So look at how we tried to communicate that out to the world. So we went through Harvard Business Review to try and target managers. We went through a trade journal called the Compass, the American Society for Safety Engineers, to give them, these are the actual people who host these safety inspections and who make the investments in preparation for them and in response to them. We spoke to oil and gas operator inspection program. So this is the regulators, a US regulatory agency. That is all about the OSHA inspections. And then for the food inspections, we did 2 things. We wrote this HBR article, and we actually wrote like a 2-page summary and sent it out to all the food inspectors whom we could find across the US to just give them a few tips about what we found. And then concurrently, I wrote a case that uses some of the techniques that we were refining in one of these papers, so we can teach this context and these techniques in the classroom. But to your question you brought about like how effective all this is, it goes back to my question earlier. It is very hard to assess the extent to which that has moved the needle on any of this stuff. It was helpful because for the OSHA ones, we periodically presented in Washington, D.C. at OSHA headquarters and had the attention of the inspectorate and had the attention of the head of OSHA, who, once we finished our paper, wrote his own piece, both a blog piece and then an article that summarized our insights. So, we had the credibility of OSHA behind the work as well in celebrating or touting, I guess, the findings, because it turned out to be helpful to the message that he was trying to convey as well. But, whose decision did that change? Like, I don't know. That's the next frontier. All right, let me take a couple of questions. I see some hands raised. John, please.
Yeah, I don't know whether I'm the right John here or we are more
Yes,
Johns.
you are.
But if I am, then yes, thank you. Yeah, I just wrote a book called How Ideas Move, which kinds of is a state-of-the-art review of the research done in translation studies, in organization studies, and you can say in a translation view, you would say, okay, if you have a circle of kids in the kindergarten and you whisper a story in one ear of the circle, then another story will come out at the other end of the circle, right? Because the story is translated. And actually in a translation view, also ideas like scientific ideas are translated as they are moved among people and groups of people. So there's one knowledge translation researcher called Carlisle who has developed this model of knowledge translation, where he says that knowledge that could be, for instance, research-based knowledge has to not just be transferred. If you had two groups of people and their languages are different, their cultures are different, then you had to not just transfer the knowledge, but you actually also had to negotiate the knowledge and translate the knowledge in order to bridge the two different cultures and types of languages in these different types of groups. So I just wonder, in your experience with your dissemination of your research-based knowledge, did you ever experiencing having conflicts? Because one thing is making a speech about what kinds of findings you have based on your research, but another thing is to actually having to negotiate perhaps with the practitioners the value of the kind of knowledge you have. So you actually had to translate, you had to perhaps politically negotiate your knowledge. So can you tell about any conflict you've had with your during your distributions and communications of your research work?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So of course, when you write a piece, the conflict that might arise is in the comment threads, whether it be an HBR or your LinkedIn post or whatever. I usually approach that conflict with the spirit of inquiry. Like, if that's not how they view the world, like, it's not productive to have an argument about like whose view is generally right. As academics, I think we have to be humble to always remember that our findings are constrained by the data that we have. And although we may hypothesize the generalizability of our findings, like, we don't know, right? That's speculation. And so if someone's saying that's not at all how the world works, like, first of all, what they really mean is that's not how I understand how the world works in the domains that I've experienced. And so to me, very productive actually, because I'm like, well, what domains have you worked in? Because it may well be right that they're in their domain, it doesn't work this way. And to me, that's like an interesting moderator, a hypothesis that I thought was general. And maybe they're like, no, not in my country or not in my industry or not in my region. And I want to know more about that. So I think there's ways to engage productively with what might be viewed as hostility. Not always, but at least in my experience, that's sort of the high road approach. And it maintains our credibility as scholars who are not, our job is not to proselytize, in my view. Our job is to understand and communicate what we've learned. So, if someone sees the world differently, like, that's okay. Like, I want to learn more. So anyway, that's how I've dealt with that. I tend not to get that as much in person when you present at a practitioner conference. They may also say, it's not how the world works, but they'll often say that to me after the presentation and you're sort of standing on the side as opposed to just challenging the whole thing. But if they did, I would ask them back. I'm like, what's different in your world, do you think, from this world that I studied? So I never would back down on my own findings, but I think there's a real question about the generalizability that, from our perspective, I think we have to be honest that we often speculate about generalizability. We don't really know. So anyway, I hope that's helpful, John.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let me take a few more questions. This is fun. Bertha.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. My question has to do with how you've managed to engage with the policymakers, because I see a proliferation of think tanks. And so what added value is there then for those of us who are researchers and also want to share our findings beyond our own academic circles? I'm just wondering what your experience is with that. I see a situation of competing ideas and a saturation in some areas. So how do you engage with the policymakers, especially when you have these think tanks also doing the same thing?
Yeah, okay, so a couple of thoughts here. So one is you can try and engage individuals at regulators, right? So who are the individuals who are curious about improving the effectiveness of what they're doing, right? Which is, I have to say, not everyone, right? Not everyone is interested in learning better ways to do what they're doing because they can barely keep up with just doing it the way they are doing it, right? And even learning to do things more efficiently takes time that they may not have. So trying to figure out, like, where are those touch points as individuals? Has anyone written an op-eds with their own ideas about how they might want to improve things? Like, those are potentially people who are willing to engage. So the first question is, like, can you find individuals to engage with? They're not getting, in my experience, they're not getting a lot of inquiries from academics who directly want to talk to them. And here's where I think it's really important to have a two-way conversation, not to just say, I have some new things that I want to tell you about how you can do your job better, right? You can say, let's discuss. I'm interested in doing free work to just help you do your job better. Let's have a conversation so I can understand what challenges you face so that I make sure that I spend my time on questions that are actually of relevance to you. So the spirit of inquiry and a spirit of engagement, I think, can perhaps reveal one-on-one relationships you can build. The second approach would be to create your own conference. I worked, as I mentioned briefly, I created 2 conferences in Washington that brought regulators together and academics who study regulatory effectiveness. Most of those academics were not in business schools. They're in policy schools, they're in economics, they're in sociology, but you can find them through a lit review and figure out who the main players are and invite them. They were delighted to come to actually talk to policymakers whom they mostly are just speculating about. And then it's helpful to have 1 or 2 of those policymakers who can help you navigate the policy space to say, which regulatory agencies should we invite? And who are the right people to invite? And so OSHA, it turns out, has it's a kind of internal think tank, as does the EPA. And a lot of other agencies that don't have those small groups will have individuals kind of responsible for improving effectiveness. It's kind of like hospitals have their own internal quality groups, same idea. So if you can get those people together, we did this conference not in Boston, but in Washington to make it just convenient for them. They could just take the metro to go and spend half a day or all day with us. So that's a second approach, is to try and create a community or create an event. And then the third is the think tanks. You might view the think tanks as a competitor, but they also can be a channel, right? So if they have, podcasts or they have newsletters, they're probably trying to fill it. And some of them may be open to filling it with content that is not all generated by themselves. If they have the exclusive access to your insight for even 2 months, they can be the ambassador of your ideas. It gives them some credibility because it increases the content that they're delivering and the value of their newsletter or podcast or whatever. And so they can be a channel. So it can be a synergistic relationship in some cases.
Thank you.
Those are a couple of thoughts. Yeah, thanks for the question. All right, I'll take a couple more. Lisa DeMary.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for taking my question. This gives me an opportunity to float an idea that's been in my head and actually from my peers. I'm a nurse. I've been a nurse for over 30 years. And we all know what we've been through in the last 2 years around the world globally. So when it comes to regulatory bodies and inspections, the first ones that come to my mind are Department of Health, OSHA, so on and so forth. What has happened with what occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic is that there was a great loss of trust in those regulatory bodies because they, along with healthcare leadership, many frontline workers feel failed them. And that's why they turned to social media. And that's why you saw all the posts of nurses and ancillary staff and physicians making posts that they were sending to the Department of Health, that they were sending to OSHA. You ended up with nurses taking pictures of themselves wearing plastic bags because they were being deprived of PPE because the Department of Health was failing to respond to their anonymous tips that they were putting in. In fact, the Department of Health actually said that, and OSHA said that they would not be making any inspections, they would not be doing any site visits during the pandemic, which when you're working in conditions that you feel are threatening your life, well, they are because people are dying, that wasn't helpful. So my question is really around, if we wrote something about that loss of trust, would that be palatable to Harvard or the Atlantic? I just didn't know if anyone would be interested other than someone that was directly affected by it.
So this is a little bit different from the top. I perceive this, I could be wrong. Your question is a little bit different from what I'm talking about, which is you have a research idea, you have insights from that research, and how do you get that idea out? I think yours is more, you're observing some behavior or some opinions, and you're trying to figure out how to channel those opinions. I think yes. my sense is that from HBR's perspective is they're looking for, again, their frame, best as I understand it, is what are decisions and challenges that CEOs are facing, and what are some suggested solutions? So if you teed up the problem about, healthcare, it depends a little bit like whose decisions you're trying to influence. So HBR, again, tends to be private sector oriented. So if you're trying to influence like hospital leaders to regain the trust of their staff because they felt left down and not provided with the appropriate PPE, what are the steps that are necessary to take to regain that trust? My sense is that's the framing that HBR would want. Like, what are your solutions? And do you have any evidence that those solutions are actually likely to be effective rather than just speculation? I think op-eds will take speculation, like I've been in the trenches or I've interviewed 10 people and collectively, here's our top 5 list of what company or what CEOs of hospitals need to do, or maybe even what OSHA or whomever else needs to do. My sense is like op-eds are more likely a venue for that than in HBR, because there you're maybe trying to either not leverage research insights or, or the research base is much more anecdotal, or you're not targeting CEOs, maybe you want to target OSHA itself. So those are a few thoughts on that question. I hope that's helpful.
It is. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, Tiffany.
Hi, thanks so much. Really happy to go after Lisa, actually, because it's very relevant. As I want to know more about how we can collaborate more, mostly because I had a similar background to you. I came from a practitioner background. I decided to enter academia, not necessarily shifting my career, but to try it out. Tried to do both at a time, pretty impossible. So I went into academia, and now I'm actually going to shift back into practice, because I happen to work in a field that really values research. So I can kind of do both to an extent. But what I've been shocked at is how little support there is for that, and how much people don't really encourage it so much in a university. We don't really kind of train academics to be able to then return to a practitioner life. And, you know, as Lisa was just showing, when you're working in it day to day, you have all these ideas that, you know, you think, oh, we need solutions to this. But we still need to be involved enough in, you know, in the academic world to understand how it links. So we talk about translation. What about bilingualism? Is it possible? Can people kind of keep a foot in both doors?
Yeah, so help me understand which part of the research life cycle you're referring to. Are you talking about like idea generation? Or are you talking about like the data or the theory or the findings? Like, where are you on this trajectory and what you're thinking about? Because some of this, I think the response depends on what particular problem you're trying to target.
Sure, I think there's value in the whole value chain, actually. So I think, of course, at the beginning, in developing those ideas, it's great to work together with someone, because when I started my PhD, I had all these ideas that I'd never ended up working on, essentially, because they just weren't relevant to the theoretical framing I was moving into. But then now coming out the other side, my research applies directly to my work. So it's very easy for me then to use it in my own work, and we have our own channels that we can kind of communicate it that way. And then the idea is I'd like to, you know, remain connected to the academic world and kind of be that channel for research as it continues, but not just the channel, right? Because I think that value is coming back into it as well, because I'll be experiencing things that I think need further research and need to be developed further. And I think we are kind of encouraged to diverge a bit more, whereas I think we need to converge a bit more and be working collectively throughout the process.
Yeah. So you're in healthcare, is that right, Tiffany?
No, actually, I work at the United Nations.
Oh, I see. Because healthcare is kind of an interesting exception. I'll just kind of reflect on the prior question. There are journals that are super relevant to healthcare, you know, that actually don't require a lot of the theory building that management journals require. For example, Health Affairs is a great outlet where you can basically publish your findings and then get them in front of folks in the healthcare practitioner world. And it's also a valued publication by scholars. So healthcare has this particular anomaly of a lot of their practitioners are trained in empirical methods, right? Like doctors understand the idea of a randomized controlled trial and can be convinced about, you know, like the efficacy of various interventions, because that's sort of their day-to-day job. So if you happen to be in healthcare, I feel like you're in a particularly well-suited position to have influence on practice. But all the rest of us, and including in the UN, like don't have that background. So I saw a question. I'm totally unable to keep up with the chat stream right now, but I saw a question out of the corner of my eye that asked about sort of tone and narration and orientation of the message. That comes about for me by talking to people in the space and what language resonates with them, because you're writing for a different audience. And so but for many of us, it's actually restorative, because you're going back to the way you actually wrote before you were a PhD student, back when you were like a normal person and you wrote sentences that people could understand who are not just in your narrow space. So it's been like so nice to actually write for normal people using normal language. Which actually I try and bring back into my scholarly research, because I think the idea of writing for scholars in jargon is totally misplaced as well. Tiffany, I don't think I answered your question though. So your question is a little bit about like, how do you figure out, well, let me answer a question I can answer. How do you think about questions that will be of mutual interest to practitioners and to scholars? And so in my engagement with companies, when I ask to try and get data, I always try and negotiate kind of this, what's in the Venn diagram, right, of the overlapping interests. Now, I'm happy to answer questions that they're interested in that are cheap for me to answer along the way. Like they're often interested in descriptive statistics, like, can you just do a two-way chart that shows me, on average, X versus Y? Super easy, like may never go into an academic paper, but, or can you do crosstabs on this? So you find that finding in general, but can you break it down by industry and by country? Like that's a real example that I'm using right now. Like, sure, that's easy. But, I'm not going to put that in my academic paper because there's no theoretical grounded reason to do it. Maybe as a post hoc analysis, but probably not. So trying to find questions that are of interest to the practitioner that overlap with questions that I think are of interest to scholars is the path forward for me. Like that's how I work with practitioners. And it assures me not only that they're sharing the data, they'll get some payoff for doing so, but also that that I'm answering a question that's relevant to practitioners. And that's something that when you ask yourself or ask doctoral students who are pitching ideas, like I always ask them, like, whose decisions are you trying to influence? And if they give some sort of vague answer, I'm like, go call them up and see if they'd be interested in the answer to this question. Like, it's so simple, but yet no one does it. Like, no one does it. And I don't know why, but this is a symptom of just how broken scholars are in this divide. So, people are scared of calling them or like, who do I call? Like, it's not, if it were your job, right? If like we kicked you out of the PhD program and your job was to figure out, to get 10 answers to this question, in a week, you could figure that out. And sometimes there's just this paralysis in doctoral programs because of the infrastructure and the perception of what's appropriate and what's acceptable, that it just freezes people from doing something that's just not that hard. So that's on the research topic and the negotiating data. So I hope that at least overlaps with your question, Tiffany. Okay, thank you. All right, let me go to Sejun Kim.
Yeah, so Mike, thank you for your presentation. I'm just curious about whether there is any kind of like difference in appetite between like practitioners and managers whom you meet at like practitioner-oriented conferences or at the organization versus MBA students who are, many of whom are also like practitioners and managers, whether in a way that differentiate the way you communicate with these people.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest difference in my experience is twofold. One is experience, like MBAs, at least that I teach, tend to be, in their 20s, mid to late 20s. Whereas the practitioners who go to the conferences I go to tend to be at least a decade, if not 2 decades more experienced in their careers. The other is that the practitioner conferences I go to are much more narrow in their interests, right? So I'll go to practitioner conferences where their whole conference is about managing working conditions in global supply chains, which is exactly, one of my research streams. So everyone you talk to has an angle on that. They're either a brand, or they're a factory manager, or they're an inspector, or they're a consultant. And so it's a much more target-rich environment for me to have conversations that are relevant to the particular area of my interest. So those are reasons why I tend to gravitate toward those practitioner conferences and practitioner journals. But there are some topics that you want all MBAs to understand. And if you're teaching an elective, or if you lead one of the core classes and have influence on the syllabus, you do have an opportunity, of course, to engage with that audience as well. I'll say like executive education is a bit of a hybrid because often it depends on what the topic is. But if it's a narrowly constructed program, like I've taught a program we launched here a couple of years ago, is for environmental NGOs who are kind of on their way up in their hierarchy of their organizations. That's a target-rich environment for some of my other work about collaborations between NGOs and corporations. Like that's the perfect audience. I don't even know of a practitioner conference where I could engage in those conversations, but we bring them here for a week for an executive education program. That's another way to construct an environment where you can have those types of conversations. So I hope that's helpful, Sujun.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, Gerard.
Yeah, it was interesting. I didn't hear any references to textbooks and as a source communicating to students. But further than that, I was wondering whether there's any, do we have any idea of how long it takes for ideas for research to make its way into textbooks. My feeling is that the lags are really, really long, but I have no basis to say that.
Yeah, I think if anyone on this Zoom has some insights on textbooks, please put them in the chat, because I only teach graduate students and we teach through case method, our engagement with textbooks is almost zero. So I know I have colleagues who help write textbooks, but we don't even teach those textbooks traditionally in our classrooms. So my knowledge base of textbooks is quite limited. But I agree with you, Gerard, that it seems like the edition updates, right, the frequency of the updates creates a multi-year lag. And of course, you have to navigate with whoever the author or editors are of the textbook to get it in the first place. So that seems like a several-year project. Whereas pitching an idea as an op-ed to a newspaper or to HBR is, with many of the newspapers, they require you to send it only to them, and they give themselves, as part of the terms, like 3 days to get back to you. And if they don't get back to you in 3 days, they're not going to get back to you. And that gives you the permission to then pitch it to the next op-ed venue. So, you can hit 10 journals in a month, right? Or 10 newspapers in a month. Or you can hit, HBR, and they have a few days turnaround as well for their digital. And then you can hit Sloan if that doesn't work out. So there's much more rapid. Of course, you can go your own way, of course, on LinkedIn. If you want to publish your insights in a LinkedIn post that has 100,000 members, like sustainability professionals or things like that. There's all these now LinkedIn groups where you can try and get eyeballs on it just directly, like with no delay at all, without any gatekeeper. I don't know how effective that is relative to the other spaces. But there's lots of venues that have much more rapid turnaround than textbooks. But again, I would encourage those who have thoughts on Gerard's question about textbooks, just chime in the chat. Okay, Fardeen.
Right, Prof. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Just a quick question. I think it relates very well to what Gerard just finished discussing. As a PhD student, for example, that is doing research, which I consider to be very relevant to policy conversations. What would you say regarding perhaps finding someone to co-author with, or someone to sponsor, someone to be interested in your conversation? Like the thing we see in publishing in top journals, you have to find an advanced scholar to work with. Do you find these kinds of things to be relevant in publishing in this area?
So you're asking about in publishing to practitioner outlets?
Yeah, maybe practitioner journals or practitioner conferences. If you're just emerging in the field, no one knows you and stuff like that, would you have to maybe find someone who someone to sponsor the conversation, someone to present the idea, or you just start sending to journals and stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not something that I've ever done, but it's an interesting idea. I mean, first you'd have to convince them of the robustness of the idea, and then they would have to agree to sort of take on co-ownership of the idea. So that's like a costly process unto itself. But if that person is a world-class knowledgeable person, it will then be much easier to get accepted into many of these outlets, whether a mass media op-ed or a HBR, because they bring the aura of expertise. So I can see that being an interesting strategy. It's not one I've ever pursued. It also, though, dilutes the credit you will get for the idea. So there's like a real cost to it if you care about trying to accumulate credit, especially early in your career for ideas. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. I mean, I think it's kind of hard unless you have relationships with such folks in your own university. Like, I can't really imagine receiving such an inquiry. Not that I am someone of that status, but if I were, I can't really imagine if I get an email from a PhD student whom I don't know, who says, I have a really interesting research finding. I'd love you to co-author a piece for the Washington Post with me. I mean, I just don't, I don't see why they would say yes, because that's an investment, a serious investment in their time and an opportunity, but also a risk to their reputation. And I'm just not sure it would work. But I'm trying to think of examples. I can't honestly think of examples like that off the top of my head. But my sense is just do it. Like, I mean, especially if you're a junior, you may not have the credibility at a working paper stage, but if you publish it in a top journal, that bestows a lot of legitimacy on your findings or on your ideas. And that alone is probably sufficient, I think.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Okay. Is it Yuzin?
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Sorry that another question comes up.
No, it's fine.
Yeah. Since like we're talking about engagement in research informed research today, may I also have your opinion on another voice? There seems to be also like a group of researchers who feels like we should really separate practice with theory, because in theory we are studying mechanism and also ideally the way how business should operate in work. So I find myself kind of like agreeing with both. Like I feel like there should be combination engagement in research, because for the doing study in business is important. But to some extent, I also find like the other voice seems to also make sense for me. So can I have your opinions here? Like, how do you think about these both voices?
Yeah. So I mean, again, you can go back to look to a lot of voices that said in the 1950s in the US that business schools were too close to practice and that they were just doing their bidding. You can also, I mean, another critique could be if you talk to practice, you're just going to engage in incrementalism. And the bold idea is to say reimagine capitalism. Like, who do you talk to about that in practice, right? Like, it's not anyone's daily job to think about reimagining capitalism. So I can imagine there are a set of ideas that wouldn't necessarily be all that helpful talking to practitioners, but it's just not the type of work I guess I do. Like, I do work that tries to help tries to help policymakers or managers do their job. And for that, I don't see much of a downside of talking to people. So it may just have to do with like what types of questions you're trying to explore. You know, even things like the millennial goals, the millennial development goals of the UN, there's a UN question earlier. There's lots of companies thinking about this. You know, there's a lot of greenwash and happy talk about it, but there actually are a lot of companies that are really trying to figure out how to add value to the communities in which they operate, or at least reduce the value that they erode in natural capitalism, for example. And so there's lots of examples you can pick up and construct your own narrative by talking to people and just learning what they're doing. Like, it's still your ideas, right, that are coming out in your papers. You're not just parroting what you hear, but you're engaging and you're learning and you're processing it. It's data, right? Like, it's qualitative data, how they think the world works. So to me, it seems like more data is better than less data. It's up to you to decide how to interpret and include or not include that data in your analysis, just like it would be in any sort of data set. So I don't know. It may just have to do with the questions that you're engaging.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thanks a lot.
Okay, sure. Diana.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you especially for such an insightful session and exchange. I have a paper that's been published, a scholarly article that I would like to rewrite for HBR. And I have been surveying a particular space, a stream in HBR on this. And I have noticed that there are some writers who are freelance writers. And I was wondering about the mileage of getting in touch with them, how to get in touch with them, whether that would make better sense than writing the piece myself. Can you give some comments about this, please?
Yeah, sure. I engaged a freelance writer once to try and save time, and or even twice. And in both cases, I ended up kind of rewriting it myself anyway. But it was kind of interesting to see how they characterized my work, but it wasn't really how I wanted to characterize my work. So I think that the market for freelancers who actually understand research insights and can translate it, in my experience, is very small. There's plenty of people who can do one or the other, but people who can do both, I don't know many people who actually can do both effectively. So the thing about HBR, again, with the magazine piece, like a long form piece, those are heavily edited. Like, in fact, they're so heavily edited that some people have a distaste for engaging in that because they're not used to being so heavily edited. But the editing is done to ensure the ideas are clearly conveyed to a managerial audience, because they recognize that most scholars don't have that skill. Like, we're never trained to do that. And to the extent that we had that skill before we pursued our PhD, a lot of it gets beat out of us during our PhD program, and we've forgotten how to write to normal people. So they will help. And you can push back if you feel like this is a sexy way to say it, but it's not really what my research finds, right? Like, sometimes it goes over the edge, and you can push back and say, and then they'll accommodate that, because they don't want to misrepresent what you're saying. They're just trying to allow you to say it in the way that's most resonant with managers. So in a way, HBR's editorial process will do some of what you're looking for from an independent writer, because they'll engage with you heavily. They do much less of that, in my experience, with these the digital pieces, because those are much quicker review. It's kind of either in or out within a quick time frame, because they need many more of them, but they don't invest as much in the editorial development of it. So my experience with the New York Times, the one time that I published an op-ed there, they also wanted to engage in a lot of editorial shaping of the piece, which I was fine with. Again, you have to be sure that in the end, it's your name on as the author. You have to be sure that it's actually saying what you think it should say. But they were quite helpful in flipping paragraphs and choosing new language, and so sometimes they'll do it for you. But I have not found those crossover writers. So they may exist, but I don't know who they are. Sorry.
No, that's great. That's very helpful, Mike. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Okay, Nasrin.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the sharing insights. And can you please tell us more about choosing or finding a balance between the language or choosing the titles in different articles? Because I understand that the title or language in scholarly articles and practitioner articles are somewhat different. And I'm wondering, if we are choosing if we want to encourage evidence-based practice, we need to share our findings to the practitioners using their language. Or are we choosing the language of the practitioners to find what they are looking for actually? How do we maintain the balance?
Yeah, totally. So one thing that your question reminds me to mention is in a lot of practitioner journals, you do not choose the title, they choose the title. So you can suggest the title, but I'm constantly surprised by the titles that are chosen on my behalf. And sometimes they don't even tell you what the title is until it's live, because they don't want your feedback, because they know with academics, they will get feedback because we're used to choosing our own titles. So, I'll just take my own example of the working conditions and supply chain work that I've done. Let me just see what it was called here. So do I have the title? Yeah. All right. So the title of my academic paper was called Monitoring Global Supply Chains, or another title was Codes in Context: How States, Markets, and Civil Society Shape Adherence to Global Labor Standards. Those are my academic paper titles. Here's what The Guardian titled a piece where I summarized some of those pieces, some of those insights. They titled it, Could More Women Auditors Help Prevent Another Rana Plaza? Like, never in a million years would I've ever proposed that title or even thought of that title. And I had no influence over that title, and I found out about that title when the piece went live. But I kind of get it. Like Rana Plaza was a big deal. It resonates with a lot of readers. And the one of the 5 findings that I talked about happened to be about female auditors. And they thought that would be the one that would attract the most interest. So to some extent, to answer your question, is like, you don't really choose, they choose, which is in a way a service, right? But it's also a risk because like, if you didn't like that characterizing, like I had a piece that just came out 2 days ago in Working Knowledge, which is an HBS e-newsletter. And I saw the pre-title, like I kind of sensed what they were going to do, but then the subtitle, I was like, that's not the subtitle I would have chosen. So, you know, even in in-house opportunities, sometimes they're choosing a title that differs from what your instinct is. So that's in the language though, for sure you're using different language, like 100%. There was a question earlier in the chat stream about how do you sort of think about tone again. Like I think you read the venue that you're trying to publish in. And this actually is true for scholarly work too, like different journals have different tones and different language. Same thing on the practitioner side. So if you just like read 20 pieces, just envelop, if you want to publish an HBR, for example, read 20 pieces in HBR that relate broadly to your topic that are from the recent, 5 years, because editorial tones change, and just try and embrace that tone, or in the Wall Street Journal or in the New York Times or wherever, the Guardian, and then write in that tone. Like I'm always trying to say, like, what do you want to be innovative about? And I don't think you want to be innovative about your tone. I think you want to be innovative about the ideas. So you just have to choose, like, where am I going to fit in and where am I not going to fit in? And where I want the novelty is not going to be in my tone. It's not going to be my sequence. And this is true also for academic papers. Like sometimes I get as an editor or as a reviewer, a paper that's like turned completely upside down, where like they do the literature review last. I'm like, that is not where you want to be novel. Like, so fit in, my suggestion and what it's worked for me is fit in structurally, fit in with a tone, and the novel piece is the idea or the set of findings. And that I think you'll have the most resonant with the editors or the gatekeepers who are reviewing your work.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Okay. So by the way, for those of you who haven't gravitated yet, I'm used the hand raising feature, and that helps me figure out who to call on. All right. Matin? I might have gotten that wrong.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity. I have a question about the rapid response research as a framework to covering the theory practice gap. Because I think practitioners all the time need more time to need answer in short time, multifaceted answers for their question in short time. But researchers all the time need very a long time for deep research and expand their knowledge about the questions. And this is a problem. Their culture is different, and the time that they need is very different, and this may be the reason for this theory practice gap. Could you please tell me any do we have any framework for rapid response research that the research which has good quality to answer as a research, to accept it as a research, and it can be useful for the practitioners to answer the question. For example, policymakers cannot wait for a long time to answer academic questions. They need multifaceted answer. Do we have any framework for this?
Sure. So I'm not sure I agree that the length of the review cycle or of the creation of research is a main culprit in the research theory gap or research or academia practitioner gap. But nonetheless, it's a problem. And I think there's two thoughts I have about how that problem can be remedied. One is, I said earlier, you don't have to wait for your article to be published in order to write a piece that disseminates its key insights. So that's been true for a lot of my work. I haven't waited until sometimes I wait till it gets published. Sometimes once I have a working paper and I'm very confident that the results aren't going to be overturned in the review process, like then I will start trying to reach out and get those ideas out there. Even if I have an instinct to a finding, it's a different paper, it's a different idea. Like my work on CEO activism began by observing some patterns of behavior, and we wrote a piece about those early observations. So that wasn't even really a research finding. That was just, we're seeing something different here. And HBR sort of allowed us to write that 800-word piece in one of their, digital pieces. So that was even pre-research. But then on the scholarly research side, there are journals that actually work on a more, they've recognized this long problem and have created tracks. So Management Science now has for example, has a fast track, which is meant to accelerate the review process. So you can submit your articles on the regular track or in a fast track. And there are certain conditions about the fast track. It can't just be you want a faster review, because everyone wants a faster review. It has to be something where getting that knowledge out sooner is materially important. So to the point, you said sometimes the answer is needed much more urgently. So they've created this fast track. In other areas like Science magazine, where I published once, they are by nature fast. So within 90 days, they pretty much give you a conditional accept or a rejection, which is kind of unheard of in the management space and certainly in the economic space as well. So there are different journals that are sort of trying to figure out how to accelerate the review process on a as needed basis, because they have not figured out how to do it for everyone. So they're at least trying to create tracks. So anyway, there's a few thoughts for you, Martin. I'm not sure, like many of these questions, I'm not sure my comments are helpful, but I love the questions. Let me invite others who have solutions to Martin's problem to chime in the chat with some thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Ibrat.
So just on this, Mike, what are your thoughts on, so let's say, I'm doing my research and maybe I'm doing my data analysis, and I'm perhaps noticing things that are either not directly related to what I'm kind of the main idea of my research, but it's there because I have so much rich data. Or maybe it does relate to my main research topic, but it may not necessarily go into the scholarly journal, partly because scholarly journal is more interested in theoretical and analytical aspects, but there is perhaps a rich empirical story there. What are your thoughts in terms of, trying to write a piece before submitting your written piece for the scholarly journal?
Yeah, I mean, I think you should think about, I tend to think about it a little bit as this, again, sort of this concentric circles piece, where what's of interest to managers versus what's of interest to scholars is overlapping, but not completely overlapping. And so I think it's great to leverage both the findings from the scholarly work as well as findings that scholars might not be interested in, but practitioners would be. I think you're asking a slightly different question, which is what about if it's content that is only relevant to scholars only relevant to managers and not to scholars? I just haven't come across that myself yet, but I don't see a problem in doing that from the practitioner journalist perspective, because they don't really care what's interesting to scholars. They care what's interesting to their readers. So it seems like, sure, why not? Again, the risk of doing things before it's peer reviewed is, the peer review process might reveal some problems you hadn't thought about that might negate or reverse your findings. Even something as simple as a crosstab or a t-test, you may not have thought about how the data was constructed and what potential biases there are in the data set that you're analyzing. So it doesn't mean your t-test or your crosstabs are invalid, but it would severely perhaps restrict the generalizability of the data of those insights. And so the peer review can be helpful in flagging these issues. So there's a risk of getting ahead of it, but of course there's a gain as well, because you don't have to wait the 3 years or whatever it takes for the peer review process to get resolved. So it's sort of a yes, but with a cautionary asterisk.
And maybe perhaps taking kind of a step further on this question, I mean, what would be your advice to perhaps, doctoral researchers who are thinking about writing something for outside of the scholarly publications, do you have any particular suggestions in terms of what might be easier kind of channels to start thinking about and aiming to write the piece for, or other ways of thinking about it?
Sure. So, all right. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to speak to that in a concluding slide. So I skipped a couple of examples, but you can read them if you are interested afterwards. Let me give you my final thoughts slide though, because it speaks to some of these things. So one, I've been sort of hitting on this theme of sequence isn't always publish scholarly article, then disseminate it. You can do it at the working paper stage, but again, the caution results might change. You can even do it at the pre-working paper stage to test the waters of ideas and maybe solicit data. And that's something that we did with in my CEO activism work. The second is that dissemination can spark two-way engagement. It's not necessarily just a one-way thing. So you might get some ideas from managers again about how that comports with their experience or doesn't. Back to an early question. It can spark invitations to present at practitioner conferences, which is yet more ways to sort of get two-way conversation going. And it can lead you to accessing proprietary data. Like companies might say, that's an interesting idea. Let's test it out. And I'm happy to give you data to do so. So it's not just a one-way thing. Let's see. This is getting a little bit to your question you brought, leveraging channels is much easier than launching one. So as opposed to thinking that you're going to launch and gain a bunch of followers yourself in a new channel you set up, or just through your own Twitter or LinkedIn, I strongly encourage you to try and leverage the existing outlets and podcasts and other things like that. LinkedIn groups. Some of these have gatekeepers, but a lot of them don't. Like the LinkedIn groups don't have gatekeepers. You can just post and see what happens. If you find a LinkedIn group, that's the community you want to influence. Of course, the existing outlets and podcasts all have gatekeepers, but hearing their responses is also knowledge, right? Even if they turn you down and you ask, can you just give me a sense of why? I'm new in my career if you're a doctoral student, and you can learn from that exchange. Creating new institutions to launch and disseminate research is hard. Again, so I ran these 2 DC workshops. They were quite successful that day. They had about 100 people, 50 scholars, 50 regulators, a lot of great exchanges that day. The idea was to launch a more enduring conversation and try and spark some new research projects. And that pretty much failed. It was really hard to actually get legs on that. I created a microsite, a website to feature working conditions in global supply chains literature and findings. I'll just show you a picture of that. That's what it looks like. The URL's at the bottom, where we wrote little managerial summaries of research in this space, because the research in this space is coming all over the place in terms of which journals, right? It's coming from business schools, it's coming from sociology, it's coming from economics. And I wanted to create a one-stop shop for managers in the media interested in this topic. It's been really hard to get traffic to that site. Now, again, we don't need a lot of traffic to that site. We just need the right people. But even that's been a real challenge. So speaking, from my own experience, creating channels really hard. And this speaks to your point you brought about sort of what's easier and what's harder. Leveraging existing channels is a lot easier. Not easy, but a lot easier. All right, so a couple minutes left. Ibrat, do you want to draw any questions from the chat to our attention, or should we just go back to hands, or how do you want to use the last few minutes?
I mean, I would invite hands if there are any, and if there aren't, we can bring the session to a close.
Okay, great. Any other questions of folks who want to voice them? And if you put it in the chat and you want to voice it anyway, feel free. Any final questions?
I have a final comment. Mike, I wrote in a recent publication that I think that the Academy needs more journal outlets that can publish, the short, very practitioner-oriented pieces. I mean, you mentioned HBR, MIT, Sloan Review, California Management Review. I think perhaps there's opportunity for other types of journals that would, be welcoming to shorter, more practitioner-oriented type pieces, something that's really relevant that we could sink our teeth into. And that's something that I think the Academy needs to do in a broader sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about why they haven't done it. Right? I mean, there are very few of these crossover journals. There are lots of business magazines, though, right? Like The Economist and Business Week, and so it's as I was just saying, is a huge investment to create a new channel, not just on the editorial side, but on the reach side. Like, how do you get managers to value it? There have been some recent attempts to create new such journals. You have Rutgers has created one, Stanford created one. There's a cross academic, I can't remember what it's called, but there's another recent one that tried to create such a thing. I think it's really hard for them to get readers, unless they're narrow. Like the Stanford one is the social science, I forget what it's called. It's SSIR, I think, or I can't remember.
Stanford Social Innovation.
Yeah, so that's really helpful because that's got a narrow target, right? But to imagine a general readership one like HBR or Sloan, I mean, those are at least the HBS one is ad based. And that's like, great if you can get the flywheel of readers and advertisers and subscribers, but that's a big investment that someone would need to make. So it's interesting to hear you suggest that. AOM kind of tried to do that with some of their journals, but I don't know how successful those efforts have been. I've never talked to a manager who's referenced any pieces from those venues. So
hey, Mike, I have another follow-up question for you, Mike. To what extent have you used social media to sort of, also to kind of get the word out? I mean, obviously you can't publish the whole thing, but just to sort of advertise your work in social media. Can you talk on that?
Yeah, 100%. So I'm doing that more and more, and on LinkedIn in particular, in LinkedIn groups. But it can't just be a piece that's like linking to your scholarly work, because if you're in a practitioner space, like they don't know how to read your scholarly work because we've trained to write in such a gobbledygook manner with all these citations that get in the way of clarity. Like it's like, no, if you were successful in getting them to click on it to look at your scholarly journal, I don't think they're ever going to click on your links again, because you're like, that's what you brought me to. So I think there still has to be this translation piece. Now, maybe you write that translation piece on your university's, blog or something. Like maybe there's a place you can put it, or even on your own blog. Do blogs still exist? I don't know if that's like a 1990s term, but some space and your own website, and then link to that. Well, that's something that might be useful. But again, you can do that, but you of course can do that no matter where it gets published. So if it gets published in a newspaper or in a HBR or wherever, it's up to you also to bring eyes to that. So LinkedIn I view as like a nice, or other venues like that, are like a nice accelerator. But the idea needs to be sort of somewhere, and the more people you can get helping you disseminate that idea, the better, compared to all resting on your own shoulders.